Hello, and welcome to a Human Perspective podcast. I'm Lola Oguntoken, a job search coach, career coach, and people operations consultant. I have spent the majority of my career helping companies of all sizes grow. Now my main focus is helping individuals grow. On this podcast, I share very human thoughts and perspectives on a range of people-related topics. I also frequently chop it up with guests who share their own perspectives. Now, I can't promise everything you hear on this podcast will always be right, but I can promise to always give you a human perspective. Let's go. Welcome to A Human Perspective. On this week's episode, we have Richard Rosser. Richard is an ex-McKinsey consultant and co-founder of Movemeon, a career companion for everyone navigating life within and beyond consulting firms. Movemeon has partnered with over 5,000 organizations to hire strategy, transformation, and general commercial management roles. I initially came across Movemeon and Rich and his co-founder when I joined a startup called Kahu. We were looking for strategy professionals and we hired some very strong people through Movemeon. I asked Richard to join me today to talk about, I'll call it a phenomenon of people who work in consulting and transition to startup companies. I've witnessed it myself. Sometimes it goes very well. Sometimes it's shocking for people who do make the jump. But welcome to the podcast today, Rich. I appreciate you joining me.
Pleasure to join, Lola. I think we need to hire you as our spokesperson for Movemeon. That was probably a better intro than I've ever done about myself.
So I always get people to intro themselves, tell us a little bit about you and how you got to the position that you're in today.
Let's not forget that we're all people beyond work. I have 3 kids and a wonderful wife. We live in the middle of the countryside next to a dairy farm. So our life is full of cows. We're obviously based in the UK, but I've done a lot of work internationally. We set up a business in Asia Pacific to serve that region. Spent some wonderful months living in Sydney, in Australia, which I can highly recommend. And I've done the same in North America, expanding over there. I'm obviously very busy with 3 youngsters when not growing the businesses. I started my work life at McKinsey, spent a few years there, and had the fortune to meet my business partner, Nick, who also did the McKinsey graduate scheme back in the day. And we embarked on a journey of entrepreneurship within the people HR technology space. So obviously things like fintech is a very famous word, HR tech, it's a bit less sexy. We've actually set up a few businesses that are centered around bringing technology into things related to people and their jobs and HR and hiring and all that stuff. And obviously the business you referred to, Movemeon.com, is one we started to solve a problem that we faced personally when we moved from McKinsey. And I guess to summarize that story, we wanted to discover new opportunities, but the ways we were discovering them felt very frustrating. You basically had a lot of headhunters cold calling you, and then you had tens of thousands of jobs on LinkedIn, very few of which seemed particularly exciting and very few in startups. So we started Movemeon really to solve the problem that we faced. It's a very curated experience. It's very specific for people with a professional services background. And we looked to do 2 things. Firstly, expose them to opportunities that they wouldn't discover elsewhere. So be that a permanent job or a freelance project, but also give them the advice and insight and guidance they need to make the right choice. So I spend a lot of my time researching, interviewing people, publishing blogs, putting out data around how salaries progress. So all that stuff, how do we help people make a more informed decision? So that's a bit about me and a bit about our broader entrepreneurship within HR tech and obviously the Movemeon platform that we're going to talk about today. And I guess lastly is I'm a startup founder. So we're going to talk a lot about startups. And so I have that experience. Yes, I'm an ex-consultant, but I've also lived and worked and built startups and supported hundreds of startups. So there's a bit of a set of experiences that should hopefully be helpful for your listeners.
You've got a lot of platforms that allow companies to post jobs, but Movemeon does a screening. So you do actually speak to the CEOs or the founders of the organizations or the heads of the department to ensure that you understand the business and you understand whether Movemeon can actually help. And that was something I hadn't seen before I had come across your company. So I think that's also an important thing to flag about Movemeon.
Yeah, we're a unique model in that respect. We're not a headhunter and we're not a jobs board. And that comes from the fact that we didn't find either particularly fulfilling experience. So our model is a classic hybrid. It sits somewhere in between.
I may be just stereotyping here, but I feel traditionally a lot of people left university hoping to work for the Big Four or a major consulting firm. And for a lot of people, it previously was somewhat a job for life. Most people go in to grow their career, to develop their career, to have very clear steps and guidance on how to develop, grow, move on to the next step. And it feels like over the past maybe 10 years, there's been a shift. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people still build their careers within consulting firms, but I am seeing more and more people wanting to experience something else, and particularly startup life. And I don't know whether it's the glamorization of, I don't know, the Facebook story. I'm not 100% sure why that shift has taken place, but it would be good to get your opinion on that. Is that something that you've seen? Has there been a shift? And if so, why?
As an overview, over the past, let's say 20, 30 years, there has been an overall shift, particularly in the UK, but I think other advanced economies, from people joining a company in the grad scheme and ending up there when they're 60 and retiring. People just move jobs more often now as an overall theme. I think within consulting firms, there's always been that reason to join a consulting firm to develop some skills and to deliberately leave it. So that's actually what I did. And I started consulting in 2008. So my plan was go there for a few years, build a network, build some skills, travel the world, and then take it somewhere else. So it's always been there as a reason. And what you have to remember about consulting firms is their organizational structure is a pyramid. So it does require people to leave. So it's always been there. But I think the point I really want to focus on is this rise of the popularity of then joining a startup, because they're very different businesses to a Big Four or a McKinsey or a Bain or BCG. Accenture, I think, has something like 1 million people worldwide. McKinsey, much smaller, but has 45, 50,000. So joining one of those, and then this sense of, oh, I want to go and join something that's maybe 30 people or 10 people, it feels strange. When I interview consultants, and I speak to a lot of consultants in senior roles across various organizations, the one overriding emotional reason for wanting to join a startup is to be at the coalface, to do the doing, if that makes sense. So what you have to picture in a consulting firm is you're advising. So client comes along, pays their money, you and your team give them advice, and then you give them the advice and they can decide what to do with it. And you rarely see the impact of the work you've done. Now, some consulting firms are much more implementation focused. McKinsey's built out an implementation practice, but you're still in the background helping and advising. You're not doing the doing. So the emotional reason people tend to opt for a startup when they leave consulting is they've had that experience of advising and helping, and they've become frustrated that they can't own it and do it and see the impact. And that's the overriding reason that people now give for seeking something in a startup.
So, as you've mentioned, the thing that is missing for a lot of people is the fact that they're not hands-on. They're not getting their hands dirty. When you're in a consulting firm, there is structure. When you go to a startup, there's no structure whatsoever. It's chaos. So it's still a bit disjointed for me as to why someone would be on a solid plank and would step off it, because that's effectively what they're doing. Is there some ignorance there in terms of what that experience will be like? Is there potentially very high self-confidence that's also making people not realize that it's like a fall, really, what that fall is? What are your thoughts around that? Because I often see that people tend to be very confident that they can make an impact and go the long haul, and genuinely do believe that they can add value. So is there some delusion?
Yeah, it's the delusion. Anybody who's a consultant considering startups, and any startup considering hiring and trying to work out if a consultative skill set fits, what I'd say to them is you need to really understand what life in a startup is like. So if you're that consultant going, oh, I want to join a startup, don't say that in a flimsy way. And there's a few things I'd advise. Firstly, I think startup is a very overused term, and it's basically used to refer to businesses from one person hiring their first team member right up to, I mean, some people still call Deliveroo a startup, or Uber. These are listed businesses, and there are phases of growth. I tend to help people segment, and I say, look, there's a 1 person to 20, 25 people. That's an environment where you're all sat in the same room. You probably know everybody really quite well within 3 months. You then got the sort of maturing phase from 20 to 75. Now, those are environments where things do have to become a bit more structured. There are probably proper teams. There's probably a management or a senior team being formed. You probably won't know the founder or CEO if you join at a more junior level. There's a sense of maturity. And then you obviously get beyond, let's say, 3 figures, 100 people zone. And really, that's a scaling business. There will be quite a lot of structure there. What I try to get people to think about is when I say startup, what do I really mean? Because very rarely do people mean I want to go and join a 1 to 5. Some people do, but really laser in, where do you want to play in that sort of 1 to 20, 20 to 75, 75 plus? And then you get some businesses that go through that. If you look like a Starling Bank, they would be 1,000, 2,000 people now. So really try to understand, what are you trying to get emotionally out of joining this startup? And therefore, what environment is going to suit you in those ranges? Secondly, I would say really bother to go and speak with startups, speak with people who've joined one, speak with people who have started a business, reach out to people like me. What you find in startups is everybody's very friendly. So if you reach out to founders, they tend to reply and give you a bit of time. So I'd say bother to do that networking. I don't like it as a word particularly, but really help yourself to understand what it's like in a startup, because a lot of people don't understand it, and they do join and they don't like it and they leave and they go and join a bigger business. But ideally they would have worked that out before joining. I'd say really zero in on what's driving you, and then get some advice and speak to some people who are in there or have been there and have done it, and pull all the skeletons out of the closet. You talked about delusion. Consulting is a tough environment. Expectations are very high. Clients are paying very high fees. So ultimately, it's a pressurized environment. So I would say that most people with a consulting training have to back themselves to succeed under pressure, which is very similar to startups. And secondly, I'd say one of the key skills, and I quite often do surveys around this, and it's an interview question that I always ask people on my podcast and videos: what's the one skill that you learned in consulting that stands you apart, that you still use it every day? The one that comes up time and time again is being able to structure. So you said something earlier around startups are chaos. They're chaotic.
Yeah.
The one skill that most consultants bring to that table is being able to take chaos and structure out the problem. Go, I've got all this stuff going on. What's the critical things we need to do? What's the critical data we need? So that is a real consulting skill that actually I do think transitions very well into startup if you're looking to hire into your startup and thinking about understanding that consulting skill set.
Yeah, makes sense. What I've seen sometimes is a lot of times founders, they want someone who has a consulting background for that very reason, the ability to bring some order to the chaos. But then they enter the culture and it's easier said than done, or it takes longer than expected, or it takes more work and patience and maneuvering the CEO and perhaps the exec team to get there. And so it maybe is not as fulfilling as one would initially think. You speak to a lot of people who have made that transition.
Yeah.
What are some of the common challenges that people tend to come across?
It's a really good question. I'll probably break it down into when you're hiring someone and also when you're that person who's being hired. So from a hiring point of view, if you're a founder, CEO thinking, I want to hire a consultant, if you don't come from a consulting background, it's very vague and opaque for what consultants do. So what I encourage founders, CEOs, senior people is to think about skills. I'm hiring for this job. Let's take an example, chief of staff. We're at a scale of, we're 50 people now. The bandwidth of the senior team is where it is. And we need somebody who can pick up the ball on loads of different projects, get them going. And that's a classic role in a maturing, scaling business. Now, what I encourage people to do is say, what's the skill set you need? So for that one, you probably need somebody who's very good at communicating with lots of different people. You probably need somebody who's very good at sort of managing process, keeping things running on time. You probably need somebody who can knock together business cases quite well. So So a very common objective of that role is say, look, we're thinking about launching this business line in addition or opening up in that market, Germany, for instance. Can you do a quick business case on, is this a good idea? What would it take to be successful? So I encourage anybody who's hiring not to think about, oh, I want to go and hire a consultant, to think, what are the skills I'm going to hire for? And it could well be that the consulting skill set applies very well into that role. So that's from the hiring perspective. When you're joining a startup as a consultant, one of the biggest learnings and tips I've been given from people who interviewed is the power of listening. This is something that consulting doesn't support you very well to do, because when a client's paying loads of money for the answer, the temptation is to tell them the answer, right? You think your job is to say, oh gosh, somebody's paying loads of money, we just need to tell them the answer. One of the things I think is important in any business, consulting included, but particularly in growth environments where you've got a lot of different people working hard, is to listen. Delay your kind of response and just assimilate. I think that really helps people settle in well into startups. Consultants can come across a bit arrogant, if I'm being honest. So just expect, particularly spending those first couple of months, really asking questions, understanding the business, challenging yourself, listening. I would give as great advice to anybody who's trying to settle into that kind of environment. So if I was to pick out one thing, it would probably be not to try and deliver too fast. Take your time to understand and to listen and to diagnose first.
I completely agree with that. I think what you've said about listening to truly understand what the problem is, because quite often the problem that is presented is the superficial problem that needs to be solved, and it takes time to fully understand that. And the second piece around jumping at things and perhaps putting too much effort too soon. I've seen that happen before, and it does lead to burnout. I have seen a scenario before where someone was rightly passionate about what they were doing. They cared about the product. Sometimes I thought that they cared more than the founder, and they put so much effort into everything, and it just became very draining, and it started to become a negative experience. So I do think, just as you said, the ability to just pull back a little bit, pull back, pace yourself, and just make sure that the energy that you're putting in makes sense. So yeah, I completely agree there.
Yeah, something I would maybe expand on in terms of consultants joining startups. You triggered me to think about it around pace of delivery. So one thing I would say is in consulting, you have the luxury of being able to analyze everything and spend a lot of time getting to the perfect answer, because the expectation of the client is the answer's perfect, I'm paying for the right answer. I think in startups, it's very different. So in our businesses, we really encourage a kind of iteration mindset. So get it done. Don't let perfect be the expense of good enough. I'd rather something was done today than perfectly next week. Get it out there and then use data to refine it. So for example, let's get a, new ad out there. Let's get it out there today. Let's see how it performs in the next couple of days. Then let's tweak it, iterate it, stop it, start it. So that mindset actually is quite different to a consulting mindset. In consulting, we talk a lot about 80-20. That is basically don't let perfect be the expense. But I think consulting actually doesn't really encourage that. Let's get it done off the list and then let's measure it and refine it over time. So that's one thing I'd encourage consultants to adopt and really switch that mindset. Startups are constrained by resources, small teams, smaller budgets. If you want to increase your team and budget, you either need to drive revenue, which requires action, fast action, or you need to go and raise money, which can be a long process. That kind of get it done, but measure it, refine it, and iterate it over time. The other thing I would say to consultants is strategy jobs don't really exist in startups. So I come from a strategy consulting background, like McKinsey, Bain, BCG are the best known, but you've got lots of other great smaller strategy firms out there as well. You need to really understand startup teams and structures and where your skill set fits in. The most similar to a strategy job in a startup tends to be that right hand stroke chief of staff job.
Yeah.
Bit of strategy, bit of project management, bit of comms. Functionally, startups as they grow start to build out teams, insights teams, particularly in big data startups. That's a real data driven, like what's the data saying? That's a real consulting skill set. So insights can be an actual home. Operations is another natural home for consultants. So if you've got an operations heavy business, it creates a lot of process and project management. So if you come from more of a implementation or maybe a big four consulting background, that can fit. But just be very mindful as you're understanding the startup landscape that startups don't really hire strategy roles and project management roles, but those skill sets do exist in certain teams.
Yeah, completely agree. It's funny because I think partnerships is also not necessarily
Yeah,
something that consultants will go into, but it's one of those roles that a lot of startups think they need very early on and they're not ready for. I think another
yeah.
thing that I have noticed that people really struggle with is career progression within a startup business. And let's cap the business at around 100 people or so, maybe 200 max. That has grown very quickly over the course of 2 years. So they've grown more quickly than they've been able to put a career progression framework in place. And quite often I see people struggle with that. They struggle with, oh, I don't know what to do next. What's my next step? How do I get a salary increase? They're expecting career progression to work the same way as a consultancy. I've seen it happen a lot of times and it just always baffles me. You do understand that we're building everything from scratch. So that means you've got to literally build your own career path. You've got to speak to your manager. You've got to prove yourself. You've got to agree on what you need to do in order to get to the next step. And you've also got to understand sometimes there isn't enough funding for you to get a salary increase. So that's also something that I see is a major blocker and that
Mm.
impacts people's motivation when they join startup businesses.
Again, goes back down to really understanding the nature of startups before leaping in. Consulting and professional services more broadly, I put accounting in there, corporate finance, etc. Quite strange in that the career path is so set out from the beginning.
Yes,
There are
yes.
analysts, and then it's consultant, and then it's senior consultant, and it's manager, and so on and so forth. And even to the extent where it's very clear that if you are a good performer on track, you will spend X years at analyst and then Y years at consultant. So you can literally say, if I am an on track good performer, in 10 years' time, I will be a director or whatever. And it's a bit of a conveyor belt that you don't have to think about. It just
Mm,
happens. Now, any other business, and I think pretty much any business,
yeah.
not just startups, it's
Yeah.
not like it's a jungle out there, right? It's a
Yeah.
jungle out there. It really is. So
It
this is not criticizing people can come from consulting. That's the only thing they've experienced, right? What I'd encourage people always to do is a couple of things. Firstly, always have a regular glass of wine or can of Coke if you don't like your wine. Sit on the sofa and go, where do I want to be in 2 years' time? I like that 2 years. It's tangible to me. When people say 5 years, I'm like, that's ages away, right? So where do I want to be in 2 years' time? And think about things like, do I want to be managing people or not? Do I want to be managing a big team or not? Do I want P&L responsibility? All the simple stuff. What do I want my work life to look like in 2 years? And then you go and chat to your manager. I'd encourage this every 6 months. So this is where I want to be in 2 years' time. If they rate you as someone good on the team, they want to retain you and help you get there. So I think one thing is just to be very conscious about it. Give yourself time every 6 months to think about it, and then chat with people you work with about it. That's really helpful. And consultants just don't have to do it. If you're performing well, you just get promoted. Salary, I think this is a bit of an eyes open thing as well. So we have a lot of data on salary. The average startup pays 22% less than the sort of market rate. So if you look at all our data around when people leave consulting, what they can earn, and so something in the middle, and then there'll be something at the top, I don't know, private equity or financial services, startups pay about 22% less than average. That's on the kind of basic salary and cash comp. So go in with your eyes wide open. Interestingly, people who work in the SaaS startups are the second most satisfied of any type of business out there. So again, we've got loads of data on this. If you check out my LinkedIn, if you check out our insight pages that Movemeon, you can see the table that goes from 1 to 50. It's only eclipsed by charity and social sector. People who work in startups are generally pretty satisfied with working hours, with their pay, but be conscious the working hours are actually above average and pay is 22% below. So I think that what that points to me is that you have to be committed to the mission of the startup. A lot of people with that commitment do actually love their jobs, but do recognize that the sort of annual pay is quite a lot lower. I think we should talk about equity and options. This is an interesting topic. Fundamentally, if you're going into a startup that you believe in, the way to align your compensation progression with your value added to the business is by being an options or an equity holder within that business. You're right, very rarely can startups afford huge salary increases all the time or justify them, frankly. Startups are popular. So there's a bit of supply and demand. If you've got 100 great people applying for every job, then you don't have to pay top of the market. But the one thing I would encourage people to think about is, am I going to get options in this business? If so, is it going to be on entry? That might be from a more senior role. If I'm not going into a senior role, then how can I talk about that? So at what point could I do this? What would I need to be demonstrating? But that's obviously the big kicker. I think we did some research around this. Senior roles, about 75% of total compensation is in the value of the equity or the option that person holds. So it really makes a massive difference. Obviously, businesses can be bust. You might not have an exit. You might not have an event where you can take that cash, but there's quite a big difference. Definitely something to think about.
When it works, it's very lucrative. I think just something to also bear in mind is that there is usually a 2-year cliff. So even for you to truly own the options, it does require you to be loyal, so to speak, or at least last for 2 years. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about equity and options. I think it's a great idea. I think if the business is managed effectively and finances are done properly, then I think it can really work. I think most startups, though, equity is a bit superficial. So I think it's also worth bearing that in mind. Just make sure that, yes, you do need to be flexible with compensation, but do negotiate as hard as you can to ensure that you're as comfortable as possible. And if you can get some equity on top of that, it's like a cherry on top. It's good. And if
Yeah.
the business is doing well, then yeah, you can afford to then push for more equity.
Yeah. And another thing I encourage people to do is reflect on, am I learning? Am I progressing? I think that's almost the most important thing in life and in terms of your career.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Very simply, do I like the people I work with? Because that's pretty
Yes.
important. Do I
Yes.
find the people I work with kind of inspiring? Do I learn from them and do they enable me to learn in my role? And I do think with certain startups, it naturally becomes glass ceilings. Take that 100-person business where, unless that explodes to like 1,000 people, your boss is probably locked in. There's probably quite a strong incentive equity wise for him or her to stay. It can be difficult to progress. You can get to a stage at that kind of like senior manager head of where you look up and go that the management team is not going anywhere. And unless the business trebles again, which is very difficult to do, I can't see my next step up. So I would say if that means you're not learning and you're not being challenged, you have to welcome the fact that you might have to move. It's quite interesting. Again, goes back down to this people moving more often. It does happen in startups where people say, you know what, I want that more senior role. And you might have to join a bigger scale up where you could maybe run one of the business lines if you're in a commercial role. But just having your eyes wide open to, am I being challenged? Am I enjoying this? Am I learning? Is a good lens to look through to work out sometimes the right time to leave and find the next step up.
Exactly. The right time to leave and to also understand the value. Sometimes you're not getting value financially, but yeah, if you're getting it through learning, you can't put a price on that. So, based on that, when is the right time to leave consulting?
It's a question literally I get asked probably every day. And here's my answer. I think ultimately, don't worry too much about it. Leave when it feels like the time is right. However, I do think there are some tactical optimization you can do. And let's put that startup hat on. If you want to join a startup, I would encourage you to leave consulting between sort of 21 months and 36 months. So coming up to that couple of years mark and just after.
Yeah.
Now, there are good reasons behind this. Firstly, if you're sat in a consulting firm and you are wanting to join a startup, it probably means that you're pretty fed up and frustrated with being in that advisory role because startups are very different to a consulting firm. So if you're honest with yourself, you're probably in an environment where you're no longer passionate and learning and starting to maybe feel a bit miserable, etc. Secondly, what you have to realize when you join a startup is startups generally into more senior roles look to hire experts, functional experts. So if I'm building a marketing team, my senior marketeer, whatever their job title, is probably going to come from a marketing background, maybe another startup or something. Yeah, if I'm hiring a COO, they're probably going to come from a sort of operational background. Now, as a generalist consultant, you are not a functional expert. What you
Mm.
have is a set of very well-honed transferable skills. We talked about them earlier: communication, problem solving, analysis, etc. But you cannot say I'm a head of marketing or
Mm.
etc. The only exception here, I think, is a chief of staff, which is a mid-senior role where that is just such a great consulting exit. So the reason I encourage people to leave at that earlier stage is because your salary expectations will be in line with a role that a startup is able to give you. So you could join in the operations team, you could join in the insights team, you could join in the business development team at a sort of managerish level, and they will hire you for your transferable skills and go, great person, great attitude, clearly loves the mission and the startup, lots of transferable skills that we like. And the salary that you're on is not going to be massively beyond what they can pay. As you become more senior in consulting, you get paid a lot more money. but that can ramp up quite quickly because you said there's a bit of a conveyor belt around progression. When you get to that sort of manager director level, a startup looks at you and says, oh, they're not a functional expert. However, their basic salary is £120,000 or $200,000 or whatever. And that's actually quite a senior hire for us. So you get into this slight tension of, if you really want to join a startup, and particularly in the earlier phase, let's say less than 100 people, you're probably going to have to take quite a big backward step in terms of compensation. And that can be hard to do. As I got to that level in my career, I suddenly had a mortgage, I had a first child. So you end up with financial commitments. That's where I think if you're more senior consulting firm, people tend to gravitate towards those scaling businesses, probably around 1,000 people that aren't a megacorp. It's not Microsoft or Amazon, but equally they probably have a little bit more structure, a bit more bandwidth around comp, some sort of level of senior hierarchy, where so there might be an exec team and then a few really quite senior rungs below that. Yeah, again, think about when you say startup, do you mean small business, less than 100? And can you take that step back? If you're really passionate about startup, my advice to pin my colors to a mast is do those first couple of years, get those great transferable skills, but then transfer at that stage.
That's interesting because I was initially thinking maybe around 5 years because you've got some solid experience behind you. You've shown longevity in your role. You would have worked on a wider range of projects, etc. And hopefully you're performing well, which is why you're still there. But I do get why you said around 21 to 36 months. I do get why you said that period of time. It's that turning point where you're about to move on to the next level up and salary starts to go up and expectations and life commitments start to come in. So that does make sense.
But it's a big practical difference to put some numbers to it. If you're in a consulting firm in the UK, a couple of years experience, on average, your salary is probably around 50,000. Let's take that as a nice round number. Might be a bit more, might be a bit less. If you've had a good 5 years in a consulting firm, you probably look at a promotion to manager. You might not be there yet. You're probably senior consultant, but you're eyeing up the manager role. Your current salary is probably 70s, 80s, if not 90s. The manager, senior manager, is knocking into the six figures. Now, that's quite a big salary for genuine startups to swallow. So I think you just get that competitive tension around, oh, I paid this. And people will look at you and think, oh, I don't quite know where to fit you into the team.
Yeah. It's hard to justify that pay.
Exactly. At that stage, you're probably managing in a consulting firm, you're maybe managing a small team of people. But again, in a startup, in order to manage those people, it tends to be in a function. If you're going to come in and managing people in a marketing function or an operations function or an insights function, et cetera, people tend, when they're hiring, to, okay, we want somebody who's not just had management experience, but had management experience within that type of function or maybe within a similar startup. It's not impossible to move at manager level by any means. Lots of people have very successfully. There's just a bit more thorny to do it. And you can have a few tensions in there, particularly around compensation.
I want to quickly go back to a point that you made around when it's time to leave a startup, where you see that you're not learning anymore. And that just made me think of something that a founder said to me once. And he said it very early on when I joined their company, which is as a company grows, you may only be suitable for a certain phase of that growth. And I want to flag that on purpose because I think a lot of people potentially go into startups thinking my next 5 to 7 years are going to be here. If that happens, you're lucky, but it is not abnormal for it to be a year and a half, 2 years. Do be prepared for that mentally as well. Hopefully, it will be longer. But sometimes you're perfect for the first year and a half, 2 years, and then it just doesn't fit anymore. Or you're perfect for the first 5 years, and then, okay, the company's now taken this new direction, or there's this new shift in the culture because the company has grown so much. It's okay for it to not fit anymore, basically.
I have to talk about energy. What gives you energy? I really passionately believe that your job is a large part of your life. It deserves to be something that really gives you energy, excites you, fits with your skill set. Those things you do when you're like, oh gosh, 4 hours has gone. For some people, that's crunching numbers. For some people, that's talking to clients, whatever. But really zoom in on where's that flow state. And am I getting energy from this? Because if you're not, that's helpful. I used to get energy from this. When I got energy from it, it was even more chaotic. And maybe the company felt too big for me, or I was really building stuff from scratch and now it's all built. So you can learn where you have natural strengths. And I love feedback. The reason I love feedback is actually not why most people talk about feedback. I love feedback because I believe people have natural strengths and it's better to build them into like mega superpowers. Like we all have natural weaknesses. And I think a lot of people with feedback zero in on weaknesses and they give feedback around how you can improve this. When people receive feedback, they tend to focus on the negative.
Mm.
We're all going to have natural weaknesses. There's loads of stuff that I'm naturally never going to be great at, and I can try to make myself slightly better. But there's some things I'm really good at, probably one or two, and I could be phenomenally good at them. I encourage people just to always do that self-reflection because there'll be other jobs out there where you can get that kind of energy back. Something I also want to talk about was I saw on LinkedIn the other day, and I really agreed with it. It was a founder talking about the different phases of growth and who you can hire. And quite often in the early stage of a startup, you need to hire relatively junior generalists. I'm going to call it bums on seats. You're like, there's so much to do, and I just need
Yeah,
like
just need
people.
someone.
Yeah, this founder was talking very eloquently and correctly about the transition to more mature businesses where you need experts, you need more senior people. You can probably afford to pay for those people, whereas there's other stages you can't. And I think that can make life quite uncomfortable for the people who've joined as junior generalists, because suddenly they've got people being hired over the top of them. There might be requirements say, actually, we don't have junior generalisty roles anymore. We need you to fit into one of these teams because we now have, I don't know, a product team and a business development team. And that can happen to consultants. And often if you're leaving at 2 years, you join into a generalist, particularly in early stage startups. That can happen. Doesn't mean you're a full performer. That's natural as part of maturing. I think it does lend itself to people finding their functional passion. Consultants, in my experience, love to be generalists. They keep their options open. One of the main reasons people do consulting after university is because they don't want to commit. Yeah, I can do this, and that transfers into all these different jobs in the future. The most successful people I can picture in my network at some point around that kind of manager level have committed to being a functional leader. I want to become the COO, or I want to become the commercial director. At some point, you've got to move from like, I'm a generalist, jack of all trades, to no, I'm going to lead a functional team. And that's where you can progress. And you will then get hired eventually as the COO because somebody goes, oh, great, you moved into a generalist role, you maybe to the chief of staff role, you then ran the operations team, you then scaled up the revenue operations team, and now a natural move is into director of ops and then COO. So I would encourage people, you can't stay a generalist forever. You probably can, but probably not in the startup. You probably want to look back into consulting, or maybe in-house in bigger business. They have in-house strategy teams and in-house project management transformation teams that are more cross-cutting roles.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in startups, if money is getting tight, it's the vague roles that go first. So you definitely want to ensure that you have a firm seat, so to speak. And if you are general when you join a startup, you need to be very intentional about where you want to go. So even if you're not sure about the department right now, be intentional about learning about each department and where you could possibly fit in, and start making those moves, either speaking to your manager or that department head, but definitely be very intentional. Don't just go in thinking, oh, I'm a generalist and that's going to just work out magically. Definitely be intentional about it.
I think intentional, Lola, is a great word almost to summarize the mindset shift from maybe a consulting company to a startup. Because genuinely, consultancy, you're so busy, you're working all the hours and traveling quite a lot. And then in the background, career progression is just not something you have to think about. Right? It's do this, I get a review every 6 months. And if I do a good job, then I get promoted after 2 years. And startup career progression jungle out there is all about that introspection, having a plan, talking with your colleagues about your plan and where you want to go, and being intentional in a way that you just don't have to be. You usually have to be more at senior levels in consulting firms where you make partner and you have to have your business case and go build business. But at those junior levels, it's really not something you have to think about that much.
Startups, like you said, they're a jungle. It's the survival of the fittest, right? You've got to be ready for that. So I want to go back to Movemeon. I've given a high level summary, but it would be good for people to understand how they could potentially work with you and Movemeon, and how they can find you.
Sure. Movemeon.com is where you're going to find us. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm very lucky. About 35,000 people have chosen to follow me on LinkedIn, which I'm always astonished by.
It's hard
So
work. That's not luck. It's hard
and I've ignored them for 3 weeks because I've been on holiday, and I'm a big believer in downing tools on holidays. If you're hiring, as you said earlier, we've partnered about 5,000 businesses. We're a global platform, done hiring in over 100 countries. So pretty much wherever you are in the world, send us an inquiry. We partner with all types of companies, everything from the biggest corporate to very early stage startups, consulting firms, private equity funds, venture capital funds, etc. We're not just for startups. Startups are a great customer base for us. About 35% of our customers are in that startup scale-up phase, but if you're not, are also appropriate. In terms of roles or jobs and teams that hire through Movemeon, within bigger companies, it tends to be that strategy team, that transformation team, the project management team. But talking specifically about startups, we're famous for chief of staff. That is a classic ex-consulting role. We are also famous for senior leadership when you start to build that team. So COO is a very popular hire through Movemeon. Typically, that is someone who used to be a consultant and has probably spent 10 years in industry and operations. So it has that consulting background, but isn't currently a consultant. About 60% of our user base, by the way, are not current consultants. They're former consultants who are now doing various functional roles. Commercial teams, so if you're a commercial director, revenue operations, things like that. So that kind of real engine around the operations and the commercials of the business, all those teams. Insights is another popular team that draws on that analytical prowess that consulting firms have. We are equally well known for permanent jobs as we are for freelance projects. So often companies will come to us and say, oh, we don't think we need a permanent hire, but we want somebody to review our pricing and we want a pricing expert to do that. And about 7,000 independent freelancers use Movemeon to find freelance project work. We're not a Fiverr. It's not design me a logo or by the hour. It tends to be a few weeks to a few months of work. You talked a little bit earlier about our model, which is a hybrid. Our output, if you're hiring to you, is a short list of candidates to interview. We are total zero hassle. Our clients tend to be very busy. They tend to be chief people officers at high growth businesses with a bazillion things to do, or founders themselves, or that kind of senior person who's hiring. So they talk to us about what they need. We use our platform to get that articulated out to our community. Our community put themselves forward, and our algorithm and team help to shortlist those applications into a prioritized list. So all that happens within about a week. That speed is often something that startups talk a lot about, because traditional headhunting and search, if I talk to our clients, they'd say the biggest cost of that is the opportunity cost of not having that person's job quick enough. Right, because we're growing, so we need, like, a lot of our startup clients come to us and we're like, when do you need this person? They're like, yesterday. So the fact
Exactly.
that we can get to
Always.
that short list within kind of 7 days, I think is a massive plus that a lot of clients talk about. So that's from a hiring perspective. We're also expanding into finance roles. So our mainstay to date has been roles that consultants do. We're currently building a community of people who have done more of the accounting, corporate finance. So we'll come into CFO roles, financial director roles, etc. If you're someone who's in their career, said head over to movemeon.com, check me out on LinkedIn, same places. It's a free platform, and I really want to stress that. We don't believe in charging people to use our platform. It's not why we started the business. We started it to create a safe place for people with this background to find advice and discover opportunities. You're basically going to discover two things. Create an account, it's free, and you will get access to our jobs board. Our jobs board is very curated, so you will never log in and sift through tens of thousands of jobs. A lot of people send me a message and say, oh, I logged in and actually I was matched with 7 jobs and I want to apply for all of them. That's the
Brilliant.
experience that we want to give people. And then do check out our insights pages. Go to Movemeon and then insights tab, or just follow me on LinkedIn, because a lot come through LinkedIn. And that's all about career guidance, salary benchmarking, interviews. So I have a YouTube channel where I speak with founders and CEOs and all ex-consultants and talk about their career. That's really important to me, that people can access that guidance and I can help answer their questions. Career is important and a difficult path to navigate.
Rich, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been really great having you on the podcast today. Hopefully, anyone who's in consulting, they've made the transition, they're either learning or feel like, yes, I remember that, I can relate. So, yeah, I think this was a really great conversation. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for giving such a great sales pitch on Movemeon. Your
Pleasure.
contract is in the post.
waiting for my money. I'm joking. Thank you so much.
Cool. That was fun. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of A Human Perspective. If you enjoyed the topic discussed today, don't forget to subscribe, review, and share with anyone who may find our topics of interest. If you're interested in working with me, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn, just search my name, or email me at lola@ahumanperspective.com. I look forward to connecting with you again on the next episode. See you there.